Chapter 1. Gladys Hungerton. I often listened to Mr. Hungerton. He talked to me about economics. It was very boring, but I was in love with his daughter Gladys. One evening, I listened to him for a long time. Finally, he left. I now had a chance to speak to Gladys. She was a proud woman, and she treated me as a friend. She looked at me and said, "You're going to propose marriage." "How do you know?" I replied. "A woman always knows. But Edward, I don't love you. I love somebody else," she continued. "Who?" I cried. "Nobody really. I love the idea of someone. I want to love a hero, somebody like the great explorers Richard Burton and Lord Stanley. A man who has nearly seen death. A great hero. When I marry, I want to marry a great man." "Then I'll do something great for you," I replied. "When you do, come back. We can talk about marriage then," she said. I left her and went to work. I was a journalist, and I had to work that evening. When I arrived at the offices of the newspaper The Daily Gazette, I went to see my boss, the news editor, Mr. McCardle. "You're doing a very good job," he said when he saw me. "Thank you very much, sir," I replied. "I want to ask you a favor." "What is it?" "Could you possibly send me on a mission for the paper? Then I could write some good articles for you." "What kind of mission, Mr. Malone?" "Well, anything with adventure and danger." "Do you really want to die so young?" "No, I want to do something heroic with my life," I said. "Well, the age of exploration and romance is over." "No, wait. I have an idea. What about exposing a fraud? You could show that he's a liar. Do you like that idea?" "Yes, anything is good," I replied. "Well," continued Mr. McCardle, "I'm sure that you can talk to this man. You're good at making friends with people." "Thank you, sir," I said. "So, try to talk to Professor Challenger." "Challenger!" I cried. "Professor Challenger, the famous zoologist, the man who attacked Blundell, the journalist of the Telegraph?" "Well," said Mr. McCardle, "you said that you wanted adventure." "Yes, I do," I answered. "But what exactly has Professor Challenger done?" "He went to South America on an expedition 2 years ago," he answered excitedly. "He came back last year. He certainly went to South America, but he doesn't want to say where exactly. He started to tell everyone about his adventures. However, when people ask him questions, he never replies. Something wonderful happened, or the man is a very good liar. He has some photographs in bad condition, but scientists say that they are fakes. When journalists try to talk to him, he just throws them down the stairs. Well, Mr. Malone, this is your mission. Goodbye." My meeting was over. Now I had to make a plan to meet Professor Challenger. I knew that he hated journalists. I decided to write him a letter saying I was interested in science. This is the letter that I wrote. "Dear Professor Challenger, I am only a student of nature and science, but I am very interested in your ideas on the debate between the scientists August Weismann and Charles Darwin. I would very much like to discuss some of your ideas. I believe you are the real expert on this matter. I have many questions to ask you about this fascinating subject. Please could I visit you at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning? Yours respectfully, Edward D. Malone." Chapter 2. Professor Challenger. Later, I received a letter from Professor Challenger. "Dear Sir, I received your letter. You can come to my house. However, I am a great scientist, and I do not need your good opinion of me. Show this letter to my servant when you arrive. I do not want any of those horrible journalists in my house. Yours faithfully, George Edward Challenger, Professor Challenger. The next day I went to his house. A servant opened the door. Is Professor Challenger expecting you? He asked. Yes, he is, I answered. Have you got the letter? He continued. I showed the letter to his servant and walked in. A small woman stopped me. She looked more French than English to me. Do you already know my husband? She asked. No, I don't, I answered. Well, then I must apologize for him now. He's a perfectly impossible person. Do not argue with him. He can be dangerous. Do you want to talk about South America? Yes, madam, I answered, because I could not lie to a lady. Oh, that's a very dangerous subject. Just say that you agree with him. Call me if he seems dangerous. I can usually control him. The servant then led me into Professor Challenger's study. I was surprised when I saw him. He had a very large head and a big black beard. His chest and arms were enormous. Well, he said, I am the student who wanted to ask you some questions about Weizmann and Darwin, I said. Perhaps your opinion of Weizmann was too critical, I continued, and recent experiments show that maybe he's right. Well, he said seriously, you know that the cranial index is a constant factor? Naturally, I answered, but I did not understand anything. And that germplasm is different from the parthenogenetic egg? Oh yes, I cried, and I was surprised at my courage. But what does this show? He concluded. I don't know. What does this show? It shows, he said in a loud voice, that you're one of those horrible journalists and that you're not a young scientist. I talked nonsense to you. My words had no real meaning. He stood up, and I was surprised because he was extremely short. He began to walk in my direction. You mustn't attack me, I said. But I will, he answered. He attacked me, and in a second we went quickly out of the front door into the street. Fortunately, just then, a policeman arrived and said, What's happening? This man attacked me, I said. Do you want me to arrest him? He asked. No, I replied. I was wrong too. The policeman walked away. The professor looked at me and smiled a little. Come in, he said. I want to tell you something more. We entered his house again. Mrs. Challenger was extremely angry. You're terrible. You're not a famous professor at a great university because you always attack people, she shouted. The professor grabbed his wife and put her on top of a pillar. Put me down, she shouted. Say please, he answered. No, put me down now, she continued. No, say please, he said again. Please, 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 she shouted. Then the professor took her down and gave her a big kiss. After this, the professor and I returned to his study. I'm going to talk to you about South America, he said. 2 years ago, I went on a journey to South America. I went to the Amazon to check some observations of the scientists Wallace and Bates. During my stay in the Amazon, I became a friend of the Cucama Indians. They told me that there was a sick man that needed help, but before I arrived, the man died. I was surprised, however, when I saw him. He was a white man, not an Indian. His name was Maple White, and he was from the United States. He was an artist. Here are some of his pictures. I looked at them. Some were of the Indians, and others were of different animals like turtles and alligators. "Well," I said, "these don't seem very unusual." "Look at the next one," he said. It was a picture of a cliff with a thin, high tower of rock in front of it. "I don't know anything about rocks," I said. "Well, try the next picture then," he said. The next one was of a man next to a huge and very strange lizard. "Why did he draw this?" the professor asked. "I don't know. Perhaps he drank too much gin," I answered. "Or perhaps he really saw this creature," he said. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't want to fight with him again. "Anyway," he continued, "the Indians took me to the cliffs in Maple White's drawings. I took some photographs. Most of them got wet during my journey home. Here is one that you can still see. Look." I looked carefully at the photograph. It was not in very good condition. "What do you see?" he asked. "I see the same cliffs and the rock tower of the drawing," I answered. "Yes, of course. But what do you see on the top of the rock tower?" "I can see a tree. And on top of the tree, a large bird. It's not a bird at all," he concluded, "and I shot it." He then pulled a wing out of a drawer. "Is that the wing of a gigantic bat?" I asked. "No," he answered. "It's the wing of a pterodactyl. Look at this book." He then showed me an illustration in a book that compared the wings of birds, bats, and pterodactyls. "This is incredible," I cried, because now I really believed him. "How is it possible?" "It seems that a volcanic action pushed up a huge area of rock millions of years ago. This area was protected, and so the animals on this plateau continued to live. They never changed, and they're still there today." "Why don't you tell other scientists about your discoveries?" "I told them about them, but they laughed," he said. "Tonight there's going to be a lecture at the Zoological Institute Hall on The Record of the Ages by Mr. Waldron. I'll be there. Come and you'll see the reaction of other scientists to my discoveries." I promised to come and left Professor Challenger. Chapter 3. Question. That evening, I arrived at the Zoological Institute Hall. Outside, there was a large crowd of people. Inside, there were professors and also a large group of students. They were happy and noisy. Mr. Waldron, some scientists, and Professor Challenger sat at the front. Mr. Waldron began his lecture. He told us about the origin of our planet. He told us about the evolution of life from simple sea animals to fish and reptiles, and finally to mammals. Then he began to talk about the dinosaurs. Fortunately, those terrible reptiles were extinct long before humans appeared on this planet. "Question," someone said in a loud voice. Mr. Waldron stopped for a moment, but then he continued. "Those terrible reptiles which were extinct before the coming of man." "Question," shouted someone again. Mr. Waldron looked with great surprise at the scientists near him. He then saw Professor Challenger, with a smile on his face. "Ah, I understand," said Mr. Waldron. "It's my friend Professor Challenger." And then he continued his lecture. But it did not end here. Every time Mr. Waldron talked about extinct prehistoric life, Professor Challenger interrupted him. Then the students began to shout, "Question!" with the professor. "These interruptions must end!" shouted Mr. Waldron angrily. For a moment there was silence in the hall. Then Challenger stood up. "I must ask you, Mr. Waldron," he said, "to stop saying things that are not scientifically true." Some people began to shout, "Send him home!" and others, "I want to hear him!" Professor Challenger sat down again and smiled. Mr. Waldron finished his lecture quickly. Finally, Professor Challenger had his chance to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "Mr. Waldron is not a real scientist. He only explains our work to the general public. He is wrong when he says that certain animals are extinct. Nobody here believes me, but I am a prophet of science. I am like Galilei and Darwin, and Here there was a long interruption. The professor walked forward and raised both hands. Everybody became silent. "I won't say any more. You can, however, test my ideas. Do you want to send somebody as your representative?" Then, the famous scientist Professor Summerlee stood up. "Are you referring to the discoveries that you made in the Amazon 2 years ago?" asked Professor Summerlee. "Yes, I am," replied Challenger. "And why didn't Wallace, Bates, and other famous explorers of that region see these things?" continued Summerlee. "Perhaps, sir, you have confused the Thames with the Amazon. The Amazon is a much larger river," answered Challenger. "It's about 6,000 kilometers long. It's not strange that I saw things that they did not see." "Yes, of course," continued Summerlee. "I understand the difference. We can't test or prove your discoveries. Perhaps you can tell us the exact location of your discoveries." "I can't give that information now. Will you go on an expedition to test my discoveries?" "Yes, I will," answered Summerlee, and the crowd cheered. "Then," said Professor Challenger, "you'll have all the information you need to go there, but you can't go alone. Who will go with Professor Summerlee to the Amazon?" This was a difficult moment for me, but I thought about Gladys. "I will go," I cried. "Name! Name!" shouted the audience. "My name is Edward Dunn Malone. I'm a journalist for the Daily Gazette," I answered. In front of me there was another man standing. "What's your name, sir?" asked Challenger. "I'm Lord John Roxton," he answered. "I've already been up the Amazon. I know the area well." Lord John Roxton is a famous hunter and traveler. "He and Mr. Malone will be perfect for this mission," said Professor Challenger. The meeting was over. I walked out of the hall into the night. I was walking down the street when somebody touched my arm. It was Lord Roxton. "Mr. Malone," he said, "we'll be companions on this adventure. My house is near here. Come with me. I want to talk to you." We went to Lord Roxton's house. It was full of strange objects from around the world and the heads of wild animals. He gave me something to drink and a cigar to smoke. We sat down in comfortable armchairs and began to talk. "Well," he said, "we did it, young man. I certainly didn't plan to go on this expedition. What about you?" "No, not at all." "Can you shoot?" he asked. "Quite well," I answered. Then he took out a rifle and said, "This is a very good rifle. I used it against the slave traders 3 years ago. Sometimes, young man, you must fight for human rights and justice. I fought my own personal war against the slave traders in Peru. I killed many of them. In the end, I killed Pedro Lopez, their leader." He then took out another gun and gave it to me. "So," he continued, "what do you know about Professor Challenger?" "I met him for the first time today," I answered. "And how did you become interested in this expedition?" he asked. I told him a little about my meeting with Professor Challenger, and he listened carefully. Then he pulled out a map of South America and put it on the table. "I believe he told you the truth," he said. "I love South America. I've seen it all. I think it's the most wonderful place on this planet. Once you know it, you'll understand that anything is possible. Anything. The Amazon River flows through a forest almost as big as Europe. Why can't there be something new and wonderful in such a place? And why can't we be the men to discover it?" We talked a little more, and then I left. Finally, the expedition was ready, and Professor Summerlee, Lord John Roxton, and I walked towards the boat. But before we got on the boat, we heard somebody shout. It was Professor Challenger. "I have a few things to say," he began. "First, I have no reason to thank you. The truth is the truth, and your expedition has no importance to me. My directions and instructions are in this closed envelope. You must open it when you arrive at a town on the Amazon called Manaus, and only on the day and at the time which is written on the outside of the envelope. Is that clear? Mr. Malone, you can write anything you want in your letters to the newspaper, but you can't give any details about your exact destination. Goodbye, sir. After meeting you, I hate journalists a little less. Goodbye, Lord John. I can see that you don't know anything at all about science, but you'll be able to hunt dinosaurs. And goodbye to you also, Professor Summerlee. If you can possibly learn anything, I'm sure this expedition will be good for you." After this, he turned and left. Chapter 4. Into an Unknown World. We traveled across the Atlantic to the city of Para in Brazil. Here we hired a black guide named Zambo, who fortunately spoke some English. We also hired Gomez and Manuel, who were half Indian. They both knew the Amazon very well. Then we traveled by boat up the Amazon to the town of Manaus. Finally, it was the 15th of July at 12 o'clock, the day and hour when we could open the envelope. We were all standing around a table. Lord John picked up the envelope and opened it. He pulled out a piece of paper. He put it on the table, but there was nothing written on it. He turned it over, but there was nothing there. Professor Summerlee laughed. "With this piece of paper, Professor Challenger is telling us that this is all ridiculous and that he's a fraud," he cried. "Now, we can return home and tell everybody that he's a terrible liar." Just then we heard someone say, "Can I come in?" There, to our great surprise, was Professor Challenger. "I'm afraid I'm a few minutes late," he said. "Is everything ready for your journey?" "We can start tomorrow," I said. "Good. You don't need a map now because I'm here." The next day, we began our journey up the river in a boat called the Esmeralda. At the beginning, the river was wide. It was like traveling on a lake. On the fourth day, we turned into a tributary. 2 days later, we reached an Indian village. We got off the boat here, and on the 2nd of August, Professor Challenger sent the Esmeralda back to Manaus. Some Indians built 2 canoes for us, and we took 2 more Indians with us. They were with Professor Challenger the first time. They seemed terrified to repeat the journey. We got into our canoes and began to travel up the narrow river in the middle of the primeval forest. Fabulous tall trees stood over us. They were like the columns of a church. On the 3rd day, we heard a strange noise. "What's that?" I asked. "Drums," said Lord John. "War drums. I have heard them before." "Yes, sir, war drums," said Gomez. Wild Indians. Bad ones, not good ones. They watch us every mile of the way. They'll kill us when they can. The drums seemed to say, "We'll kill you if we can. We'll kill you if we can." Our two professors were not afraid at all. They were too interested in the wonderful plants and animals around them, or they were too busy arguing about scientific theories. That night we slept in the canoes in the middle of the river. We waited for an attack, but nothing happened. The next day, we arrived at some rapids about a mile long. These were the rapids where Professor Challenger lost most of his photos on his earlier journey. We carried the canoes around them. That night, we were about 10 miles above the rapids. The next day, we continued our journey until Professor Challenger said, "Look at that palm tree there. That's the entrance to an unknown world." We pushed the canoes past the palm until we arrived at a shallow, transparent stream. It flowed through a low tunnel of green plants. The sound of the drums slowly disappeared, and the wild animals became less afraid of us. On the third day, we could no longer travel by canoe because the stream was not deep enough. We began our journey on foot. The characteristics of the land changed. We began walking higher up. The tropical forest disappeared, and there were only palm trees. After we left the canoes, we walked for 120 miles. Finally, we came to an area where there were no more trees. Then we came to a bamboo forest. It took us all day to cross it. The next day, we climbed up a hill. Suddenly, Professor Challenger saw a gigantic bird fly up slowly from the ground. "Did you see? Did you see it, Summerlee?" he shouted. "What do you think it was?" Summerlee asked. "I believe it was a pterodactyl," he answered. "How absurd! It was just a big bird," said Professor Summerlee. Professor Challenger was too angry to speak, and we continued our journey. Lord John then came up to me. He was holding his binoculars. "That was certainly not like any bird that I've ever seen," he said to me. We crossed another hill, and then we saw the high red cliffs of Maple White's picture. They were about 7 miles from our camp.